Hello, and welcome back. Tonight's story was suggested by a listener named This. Thank you for the idea. If you enjoy stories like this one, like and subscribe. It genuinely helps, but only if you actually get something out of them. I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. This episode is also on Spotify, and if you'd like to support what I do here, there's a link in the description to buy me a coffee. It helps me keep making more of these for you. For now, let the lights go dim, get as comfortable as you can, and let's begin. Close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself standing outside, somewhere in the northern half of this continent, centuries before any of it looked like it does today. The cold reaches you first, not a sharp bite, just a steady pressure that settles into your hands and works its way toward your feet. The world is unusually quiet. No insects, no bird song, just the wind moving low through bare branches and the soft, muffled sound of your own footsteps on frozen ground. Somewhere ahead of you, past the dark shapes of trees, a faint light glows. You catch the smell of wood smoke before you see anything else. Dry, earthy, just faintly sweet. You are walking toward a winter settlement. For the hundreds of distinct native nations who lived across this land, winter was never something to simply get through. It shaped where people built, what they built with, how families organized themselves, and how they planned their entire year. And here's the first thing worth knowing before you go any further. There was no single Native American house, no one universal design that solved winter everywhere. A village near the Great Lakes faced a different winter than a village on the northern plains. A community in the high desert of the Southwest faced something different again. So the people living in each of those places built accordingly. Some raised thick, earth-covered lodges that looked almost like small hills. Others lived inside timber-framed longhouses wrapped in bark. Some carried portable homes made from animal hide, built to come down and go back up in under an hour. Others built with stone and sun-dried earth, thick enough to hold the days eat long after the sun went down. 4 very different answers, 4 very different landscapes, and none of them are the whole story on their own, which is exactly why you're going to spend this night visiting each one. Now, before you get too comfortable with the idea that these homes were some kind of magic trick against the cold, it's worth being honest with you. The popular version of this story, the one that says Native American houses simply never froze, isn't quite true. It's a bit of an exaggeration. Interiors could get painfully cold. Fires burned low in the middle of the night. Storms sometimes overwhelmed even the best preparation, and winter remained genuinely dangerous year after year for every single person living through it. But underneath that exaggeration is something far more interesting than the myth. And it starts with a small shift in how you think about a house. Try, for a moment, to stop picturing a house as a heated box. That's the modern idea. Warm the whole building, every room, every hallway, whether anyone is standing in it or not. That's not what was happening here. Think of shelter instead as one part of a much larger system for holding onto human warmth. The goal was never to make every corner of a room pleasant. The goal was to keep the people inside warm enough to sleep, warm enough to wake up the next morning and do it all again. That one shift changes almost everything about how these homes worked. A resting adult produces heat all on their own, all the time, simply by being alive. Put a handful of people together inside a small, well-built space, and that warmth becomes something you can actually feel. Add a modest cooking fire. Add clothing built for the cold. Add bedding designed to trap heat against the body rather than let it drift away. Suddenly, the math starts to work in your favor. None of it required a roaring blaze. It required a space small enough and smart enough for the warmth already in the room to matter. Firewood, after all, was never free. Someone had to find it, cut it, carry it home, and keep it dry through months of snow and freezing rain. A house that wasted heat also wasted somebody's labor, somebody's hours, somebody's aching back. So long before the first flame was ever lit for the season, the real work of staying warm had already begun. It began with the land itself. You step back outside for a moment. The wind finds you immediately, sliding low across the frozen ground and pulling at your clothing. But walk a few hundred paces past a stand of trees, down into a gentle hollow in the land, and something changes. The wind eases. The air feels calmer against your skin. You haven't gone indoors. You haven't lit a fire. You've simply moved into a place where the landscape is already doing part of the work for you. This is where the story of a warm winter home really begins. Not with walls, with the ground. People who lived somewhere for generations came to know that ground the way you might know the layout of your own kitchen in the dark. They knew which hillside blocked the worst of the winter wind, and which one only looked sheltered from a distance. They knew where the afternoon sun lingered a little longer against a slope, warming the earth just enough to notice. They knew which low ground stayed damp and miserable through the thaw, and which high ground caught every gust that swept across the plains. That knowledge came from decades, sometimes generations, of paying close attention. Built somewhere, the wind hits hard all winter, and you find out. Choose damp, low ground, and you find out. There was no thermostat to blame for a cold night. There was only the choice of where you built, and whether you'd chosen well. Even snow itself became part of the calculation. It sounds strange, but snow holds a surprising amount of trapped air inside it, and trapped air is a very good insulator. Piled up naturally along the base of a wall, snow could actually help hold warmth, and rather than let it escape. Of course, too much of it caused its own problems. Roofs had to bear the weight. Entrances had to stay clear. Melting snow brought moisture, and moisture was the enemy of every insulating material people relied on. Winter shelter, in other words, was never really a battle against nature. It was closer to a long, careful negotiation. And the people who understood the terms of that negotiation were the ones who came through the season safest. Location decided far more than comfort, too. A family needed to reach fresh water without a dangerous walk across open, wind-blasted ground. They needed access to firewood that wouldn't run out by midwinter. They needed to stay close enough to relatives and neighbors to share labor when the weather turned dangerous, because a single household rarely survived the hardest stretches of winter entirely on its own. Someone gathered fuel while someone else repaired a damaged wall. Someone watched the children while someone else worked outside in weather nobody wanted to be in for long. Winter shelter was never only architecture. It was community, functioning as a kind of insulation all its own. You turn back toward the settlement as the light starts to fade. Smoke rises gently from somewhere ahead, drifting straight up rather than tearing sideways in the wind. That tells you something before you've even reached the door. These homes weren't built in the open, exposed ground. They were built where the land had already softened the worst of what winter could throw at them. The wind had been dealt with before a single wall went up. And once you understand that, the four kinds of homes you're about to walk through start to make a different kind of sense, not as separate mysteries, but as four thoughtful answers to the same basic question, asked by people living in four very different corners of a very large continent. The first answer waits for you along the wide, slow bend of a great river, where families built something that looked, from a distance, almost like the land had simply risen up around them. You follow the smoke down toward the river, and the settlement comes into view a little at a time. Not sharp, angular buildings, rounded shapes, low and heavy, scattered along a bluff above the water. From this distance, in the fading light, they could almost pass for small hills. That's not an accident. That's the entire idea. These are earth lodges, homes built by farming peoples along the upper Missouri River. Among them the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara. Their villages sat on high ground above the river for good reason. The bluff gave a clear view of the surrounding land, kept the settlement above spring floodwater, and put just enough distance between the village and the wind that came howling off the open plains in winter. Already, before a single log had been set into the ground, the site had done part of the work. You walk closer, and the size of these homes starts to register. Some earth lodges were modest. Others were large enough to shelter an entire extended family under one roof, sometimes 40 feet or more across. Big enough, in the later years after horses arrived on the plains, to bring the family's most valuable horses inside during the worst cold, right alongside the people who own them. That single detail tells you something important. This wasn't a shelter thrown together out of desperation. It was a serious, deliberate piece of architecture, built to last for years and rebuilt with real skill when it finally wore out. The frame comes first. 4 heavy center posts, cut from cottonwood, rise up and support the massive roof beams that carry the weight of everything above them. Around this central frame, smaller posts and beams form a wider ring, sloping gently up toward the middle. Over that timber skeleton goes a layer of woven willow branches, tightly packed, forming something close to a wooden lattice. Then comes a thick bed of dry grass laid over the willow, and on top of all of it, packed hard and heavy, comes the earth itself. Sawed, cut and layered, covers the entire structure, sometimes more than a foot thick across the roof and walls. Reach out and press your hand against that outer wall. It doesn't feel like a house at all. It feels like packed ground, cool and solid and strangely reassuring. That's the whole secret, or at least the biggest part of it. Soil does not behave the way winter air behaves. Air temperature can swing wildly between afternoon and midnight, rising and falling with every gust of wind and every hour of sunlight or shadow. Earth changes far more slowly. A foot or two of packed soil sitting between you and a sub-zero night doesn't just block the wind. It acts like a massive, patient buffer, one that barely notices the difference between a cold afternoon and a brutal midnight, because it's too heavy and too dense to change its temperature that quickly. The people who built these lodges may not have described it in those exact terms, but they understood the result perfectly well. A well-built earth lodge held its warmth through the night in a way that a thin bark or hide shelter simply couldn't. You duck through the entrance passage, and this is worth pausing on for a moment, because the entrance itself was doing real work before you'd even reached the fire. Rather than a single door cut straight through the wall, many earth lodges used an extended entryway, a short covered passage jutting out from the main structure. Cold air doesn't flow in a straight line through a bent passage the way it does through an open doorway. That small architectural choice, a simple bend in the path, meant that wind couldn't drive straight into the living space every time someone came or went. It had to work its way around a corner first, and by then, most of its force was already spent. Inside, your eyes take a moment to adjust. The light comes from a central hearth, a modest fire burning low in a shallow pit near the middle of the floor. Above it, a smoke hole opens toward the sky, usually fitted with some kind of cover, a stretched hide or a woven screen that could be adjusted depending on which way the wind was blowing that night. Too much draft through that opening, and the fire's heat escaped straight up into the cold. Too little, and smoke filled the room. Somebody, every single evening, made that small judgment call. Open it a little more. Angle the cover this way instead of that way. It sounds like a minor chore. It was actually a constant, quiet exercise in reading the wind, repeated by people who had been doing it and teaching their children to do it for generations. Around the walls, you notice the space is organized with real intention. Sleeping areas sit along the perimeter, often built up slightly from the floor and screened by woven mats or hung hides, giving each part of the extended family a small measure of privacy without needing separate rooms. Storage pits are dug directly into the floor in places, lined and used to keep dried corn, beans, and squash safe through the winter months, because these were farming communities, not just hunters following game. The fields outside the village, planted and tended through the warmer months, were what made a long, settled winter in one place possible at all. You cannot really separate the shelter from the food. A warm lodge with empty storage pits wouldn't have kept anyone alive through a hard winter, no matter how well the walls were built. Sit for a moment near that central fire and feel how the room actually holds its temperature. The domed shape overhead isn't accidental either. Warm air naturally rises, and in a lodge with a rounded, sloped roof, that rising warmth doesn't just vanish into some enormous, unused space above your head. It gathers closer to where people are actually sitting and sleeping, held in by the curve of the roof itself. A tall, boxy room would let far more of that warmth drift up and away, out of reach. This shape, low and rounded, keeps it circulating where it's actually needed. And then there are the people themselves. An earth lodge like this one might hold 10, 15, sometimes more family members through a single winter, several generations under one roof. Each one of them, simply by breathing and resting and going about ordinary life, added a little warmth to the room. Add a cooking fire for a meal, and the temperature climbs a little more. None of it was dramatic on its own. Together, inside walls built to hold on to every bit of it, the effect became real. It's worth being honest with you here too. The way this whole story deserves to be told honestly. Life inside an earth lodge in the dead of winter was not soft or easy. Smoke could hang thick in the air on nights when the wind refused to cooperate. The floor near the entrance stayed noticeably colder than the space around the fire. Firewood had to be gathered and hauled in from wherever it could still be found, a task that only grew harder as winter wore on, and the easiest sources were used up. European traders and explorers who wintered among these villages, including members of the Lewis and Clark expedition, who spent the winter of 1804 and 1805 near Mandan and Hidatsa village on the Missouri River, wrote about earth lodges with real respect, describing them as far warmer and better suited to the season than their own canvas tents and log quarters nearby. That account, written by outsiders who had every reason to compare the two honestly, tells you something the walls themselves cannot. You look around the lodge once more before you go. Nothing about it announces itself as clever. The walls are simply thick. The roof is simply low and rounded. The entrance simply bends instead of running straight. But every one of those ordinary choices, layered together, added up to something that let dozens of people sleep safely through months of weather that could have killed them if they'd made different decisions or built on different ground. This was one answer to winter, a heavy, patient, earth-covered answer, built by people who stayed in one place and farmed the land around them, generation after generation. But not everyone on the plains lived that way. Somewhere up past the last of these earth-covered rooftops, beyond the bluff and the river, the land opens up into something much wider and much emptier. And out there, families needed an entirely different kind of answer, one that could be taken apart in an afternoon, carried for miles, and raised again before nightfall. That answer is waiting for you next. The land opens up as you walk. Trees thin out. The wind picks up again. And suddenly, there's nothing between you and the horizon in any direction. This is a different kind of winter altogether. Out here, on the open plains, a heavy earth-covered lodge wouldn't have made much sense. The people who lived across this landscape moved with the seasons, following the great herds of bison that their entire way of life depended on. A home that couldn't move with them wasn't really a home at all. It was a trap. So they built something else, something that could go up in under an hour and come down again just as fast. Something you could load onto a travois and carry to the next camp, then raise again before the light failed. You're looking at it now, a cluster of tall, cone-shaped shelters standing against the wind, smoke curling from openings near their peaks. The teepee. It looks simple from a distance. Up close, it's anything but. Walk up to one, and you'll notice the poles first, usually a dozen or more, cut from tall, straight pine, lean together and lashed near the top into a sturdy cone. Over that frame stretches a cover, traditionally made from tanned bison hide, sewn together in large sections and pulled taut around the poles until the whole structure holds its shape on its own. No nails, no frame beyond the wood and the hide itself. A skilled group of people, often the women of the camp, who owned and managed the teepees in most plains societies, could raise a full-sized lodge in well under an hour, sometimes in a matter of minutes once the poles were set. That speed mattered enormously in winter, when a delayed camp meant more hours standing exposed in the cold. But speed alone wouldn't have kept anyone warm through a plains winter, where temperatures could drop far below freezing, and the wind had nothing to slow it down for miles. The real cleverness of the teepee shows up once you step inside, duck through the low doorway, and the first thing you notice is a second layer of hide hanging just inside the outer cover, not touching it, but hanging a short distance in from the walls, forming its own smaller circle around the interior. This is the liner, sometimes called a dew cloth, and it does far more work than its plain appearance suggests. Between the liner and the outer cover sits a narrow pocket of air, sealed at the bottom where the liner tucks against the ground, open at the top where it meets the slope of the poles. That gap does two things at once, and both of them matter. First, it insulates. Trap, still air, is one of the best insulators available to anyone without modern materials, and that narrow band of air between the two layers of hide slows the transfer of cold straight through the wall of the teepee. Second, and just as important, it creates a draft. Cold air near the floor gets drawn in beneath the edge of the outer cover, pulled upward through that gap between liner and wall by the rising heat of the fire, and pushed back out through the smoke hole at the very top. That constant, gentle movement of air does something a sealed, airtight shelter never could. It keeps the fire breathing properly, carries smoke up and out instead of letting it pool inside. And it does all of this without turning the interior into a wind tunnel, because the moving air stays confined to that narrow channel between the two layers, rather than sweeping directly across the people sitting near the fire. Look up, and you'll see the smoke flaps, two adjustable panels of hide near the top of the teepee, each controlled by a separate pole from outside. Whoever tended the lodge could shift those flaps throughout the day, angling them to catch or deflect the wind depending on which direction it was blowing, keeping the smoke hole drawing properly no matter how the weather changed. It's a small daily task, adjusting a flap by a few degrees, but it's also a piece of genuinely careful engineering, tuned fresh every single day by someone who understood exactly how their particular lodge behaved in the wind. Sit down near the fire pit at the center, and you'll notice the floor plan is simple but deliberate. Beds line the outer wall, often raised slightly with a low frame of willow branches beneath the bedding, keeping sleepers up off the coldest part of the ground. Backrests, made from willow rods, offered a place to lean without touching the chilled outer wall directly. In many camps, the floor space near the entrance and the northern side, the side that took the brunt of the coldest winds, was left for storage and everyday tasks, while the warmer space near the fire and further from the door belonged to sleeping and to the people who most needed protection from the cold, often the very old and the very young. That doorway itself usually faced east, toward the rising sun, and away from the prevailing winter winds that swept in from the west and northwest across much of the plains. Something as simple as which direction a family faced their door could make a real difference across an entire season of nights. And the teepee didn't stand alone against the winter. Where a family-made camp mattered just as much here as it did back at the river villages you visited earlier. Winter camps on the plains were rarely pitched out in the open. Families sought out wooded river bottoms, sheltered valleys lined with cottonwood trees, places where the surrounding timber broke the worst of the wind before it ever reached the lodges. Those same wooded bottoms provided firewood close at hand, and, just as critically, bark and forage for the horses that had become central to plains life. A camp chosen well could mean the difference between a hard winter and a genuinely dangerous one, and choosing well was knowledge built over generations of moving through this same country, year after year, learning which valleys held their warmth and which ones only looked sheltered until the wind found its way in anyway. Even the base of the teepee got attention. Snow banked up against the outside wall, sometimes deliberately packed there, added another layer against the cold, much the way it did for the earth lodges you saw earlier. Inside, along the very bottom edge, the outer cover was often pegged down tightly or weighted with stones, sealing off the gap where the worst drafts liked to creep in along the floor. Feel the fire's warmth reach you now, and notice something you might not expect. It isn't a large fire. It doesn't need to be. The whole shape of the teepee, narrow at the top, wide at the base, works almost like a chimney turned inside out, drawing warm air up and gently circulating it through that liner gap, rather than letting it simply escape. A modest fire, tended carefully through the night, could keep a well-built winter teepee noticeably warmer than the brutal cold just beyond its walls. Even on nights when temperatures fell far below freezing outside, none of this made a teepee as warm, hour for hour, as the heavy, earth-covered lodges you visited before. It wasn't trying to be. It was solving an entirely different problem. Mobility mattered more than mass here. A teepee could be struck, packed, and moved to follow the herds, follow better shelter, or escape a camp that had simply run through its available firewood. That flexibility was its own kind of protection against winter, a different strategy entirely from the Earth Lodge's approach of building something heavy and permanent, and simply outlasting the season in one place. You step back outside, and the wind meets you again, immediately, sharp and constant across the open ground. Behind you, the teepee stands firm against it, its smoke rising in a thin, steady line straight up into the darkening sky. Whoever built and maintained that lodge understood something worth carrying with you as you continue this journey. There was never one correct way to build a winter home. There was only the question of what the land demanded, and how well you answered it. Ahead of you, the ground begins to change again. The wide open plains start giving way to trees, more of them with every mile, until you're walking beneath a real canopy of bare winter branches. Somewhere in that forest, a very different kind of winter home is waiting, one built not for a single family on the move, but for many families living together, side by side, under one very long roof. The trees close in around you now, tall and bare against the winter sky, and the wind that had chased you across the open plains finally begins to lose its edge. Forests do that. They break wind before it ever reaches the ground. The same lesson you learned back at the very start of this journey, when a stand of trees turned a brutal gust into something almost gentle within a few dozen paces. Ahead, through the trunks, you catch sight of something long and low, its curved roofline running far past where you'd expect a single house to end. This is a longhouse, home to peoples of the Haudenosaunee, sometimes known as the Iroquois Confederacy, whose territory stretched across what is now the northeastern United States and parts of southern Canada. The name Haudenosaunee itself means something close to people of the Longhouse, and once you step closer, you start to understand why that name mattered enough to define an entire confederacy of nations. This isn't a home built for one family. It's a home built for many, all living together under a single roof that could stretch on for a genuinely surprising distance, some running well over 100 feet from end to end, depending on how many families shared it. Walk up and put your hand against the outer wall. It isn't earth this time, and it isn't hide. It's bark, sheets of it stripped from elm trees, layered and overlap like shingles across a curved wooden frame. Elm bark was chosen deliberately. It sheds water well, resists rot better than many alternatives, and comes off the tree in large, workable sheets that made covering a structure this size practical in the first place. Beneath that bark skin, a framework of bent saplings forms the longhouse's distinctive shape, a long tunnel with a rounded, barrel-like roof, strong enough to shed snow and stand up to winter storms year after year, dug through the low doorway at one end, and the inside opens up in a way that feels almost like walking down a covered street rather than entering a single room. A central corridor runs the full length of the building, and spaced along that corridor, at regular intervals, sit the hearths, small fires kept burning through the coldest months. Typically, each fire served two families, one on either side of the corridor, who shared that hearth and lived in the compartments flanking it. A modest longhouse might hold 4 or 5 fires. A larger one could hold many more, home to a dozen or more related families at once, all connected by clan and lineage running through the mother's side, since Haudenosaunee society traced descent matrilineally, and a longhouse itself typically belonged to an extended family grouped around the senior women of that clan. Sit for a moment near one of those hearths and notice what having so many fires spread through one long structure actually accomplishes. Each individual fire didn't need to be large. It only needed to keep its own section of the corridor and the 2 family compartments beside it comfortably warm. But heat doesn't respect walls that don't exist, and a longhouse's interior was largely open along that central corridor, meaning warmth from one hearth could drift and mingle with warmth from the next, and the next after that. A dozen small fires spaced evenly through a long structure, each one modest on its own, added up to something far more effective than any single fire could have managed alone, especially once you factor in the body heat of every person living inside, sometimes 50 or more individuals under one roof during the depths of winter. Above you, notice the smoke holes cut into the roof, spaced out along the ridge line above each hearth, allowing smoke to rise and escape without needing to travel the length of the entire building first. Like the smoke hole of an earth lodge or the flaps of a teepee, these openings needed tending. Bark flaps or hide coverings could be adjusted to manage draft and keep the worst of the wind and snow from driving straight down into the fire below. Along the walls on either side of the corridor, raised sleeping platforms ran the length of each family's section, built up off the ground and layered with furs, hides, and woven mats. That elevation mattered. Cold air settles low, and a bed built even a foot or 2 above the floor stayed noticeably warmer through the night than bedding placed directly on frozen ground. Above those sleeping platforms, a second tier of shelving typically held stored food, corn, beans, and squash, the same core crops grown by many of the farming peoples you've already met tonight, along with dried meat, firewood, and household belongings, kept up and out of the way, safe from dampness and pests. That storage tells you something important about how a longhouse survived winter. Like the Earth Lodge villages along the Missouri, Haudenosaunee communities were farmers as much as they were hunters, tending fields of corn, beans, and squash through the growing season, crops so central to survival that they were often described together as the three sisters, planted in a way that let each crop support the others as they grew. A longhouse full of families depended on those stores lasting through an entire winter, which meant the building itself had to keep that food dry and protected just as carefully as it protected the people sleeping inside. Longhouse villages themselves were often surrounded by a palisade, a tall wooden fence encircling the settlement, offering both defense and another layer of wind protection for the homes clustered inside it. And much like the sites you saw for earth lodges and winter teepee camps, the location of a longhouse village was never chosen carelessly. Elevated ground near a reliable water source, within reach of good farmland, and enough forest to supply timber, bark, and firewood for years, mattered enormously, because a Haudenosaunee village might remain in one place for a decade or two before the surrounding soil wore thin, and the community moved to richer ground nearby, rebuilding their longhouses from the timber and bark of the new location. Walk the length of the corridor now, past hearth after hearth, family compartment after family compartment. There's a particular kind of warmth here that neither the Earth Lodge nor the teepee quite offered in the same way, not just heat, but the accumulated presence of so many people, so many small fires, so many lives packed into one continuous structure. Communal living was, in its own quiet way, a form of insulation. More bodies meant more ambient warmth. More families meant more hands to gather firewood, more people to repair a damaged section of bark before a small gap became a real problem. More elders and children looked after not by one set of parents alone, but by an entire extended household sharing the same long roof. None of this made winter easy. Cold still crept in at the ends of the building, farthest from any hearth. Firewood still had to be found, cut, and hauled in enormous quantities to keep a dozen or more fires burning through months of freezing weather. But the longhouse solved winter the way large, settled, farming communities have solved it in many parts of the world across history, through scale, through cooperation, and through the simple, steady math of many small fires and many warm bodies adding up to something greater than any one family could have managed on their own. You step back outside as the light continues to fade, and the forest around you feels a little less hostile than it did when you first walked in beneath the bare branches. 3 homes now stand behind you in this journey, a heavy earth lodge built to outlast the season in one place, a portable teepee built to move with the herds across open ground, a long, shared roof built to hold entire, extended families together through the coldest months of the year. One more answer remains. Far to the southwest, in a landscape unlike any you've walked through tonight, a different people faced a different kind of winter entirely. one where freezing nights followed warm, sunlit days, and where the very ground itself, baked and dried under a desert sun, became the material of choice for keeping a family warm after dark. The forest thins out behind you, and the land changes completely. Trees give way to open red and gold country, mesas rising in the distance, the air suddenly dry and thin against your skin. The cold here doesn't feel quite the same as it did in the northern plains or the eastern woodlands. Daytime sun can still carry real warmth, even in the depths of winter across much of the Southwest. But the moment that sun drops behind the horizon, the temperature falls fast and hard. A desert doesn't hold onto daytime heat the way a forest or a river valley does. Night here can turn brutally cold within an hour of sunset. Ahead of you, built directly into the base of a mesa or rising in tiered blocks against the open sky, a pueblo comes into view. These are the homes of Pueblo peoples, communities including the Hopi, the Zuni, and the peoples of pueblos like Taos and Acoma, whose ancestors built and occupied villages across this region for well over 1,000 years. In some cases, the same communities continuing to live in the same locations today. Taos Pueblo, in what is now northern New Mexico, has been continuously inhabited for roughly 1,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously lived-in communities in North America. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Some of the very structures you're about to walk through belong to a tradition still very much alive. Walk closer, and the shape of the building starts to make sense. This isn't a single house standing on its own. It's a cluster, room stacked against room, level rising above level, the whole structure climbing 3, 4, sometimes 5 stories into the sky, terraced back like steps as it rises so that the roof of a lower room becomes the front porch of the room above it. From a distance, in the low winter light, the whole thing looks almost like it grew up out of the mesa itself, rather than being built on top of it. Put your hand against the wall, and you'll feel something different from anything you've touched tonight. Not woven bark, not packed sod over a timber frame. Solid, dense, sun-dried earth, either shaped into adobe bricks and stacked in careful courses, or in many of the older ancestral Puebloan sites, cut and fitted stone, plastered smooth with a coating of mud. Either way, the walls here are thick, often 2 feet across or more, and that thickness is doing exactly the kind of work you'd expect by now, after everything you've already learned tonight about Earth and its slow, patient relationship with temperature. But the Southwest presented a different problem than the One Earth Lodge builders faced up on the Missouri River, and the walls here answer it a little differently. Up north, the challenge was mostly about holding steady against relentless, unbroken cold. Out here, the challenge was those wild daily swings. A genuinely warm afternoon followed by a genuinely freezing night, over and over, all winter long. Thick adobe and stone walls handle that swing beautifully during the day, especially on walls facing south toward the winter sun. That thick mass slowly absorbs heat, soaking it in the way a stone left in sunlight grows warm to the touch even hours later. Then, as the sun disappears and the temperature outside plummets, that same wall begins releasing the heat it stored through the day, slowly, steadily, back into the room. By the time the coldest hours of the night arrive, the wall is still giving back warmth it collected that afternoon. It's a genuinely elegant piece of passive design, and it explains why so many Pueblo villages and room blocks were oriented the way they were, with major walls and plazas facing south to catch as much winter sun as possible through the shortest, coldest days of the year. Step inside one of the rooms, ducking through a low doorway, or, in many older structures, climbing down a wooden ladder through an opening in the roof itself. That's not a decorative choice either. Many Pueblo dwellings, especially in earlier centuries, were entered from above rather than through a ground-level door, with a ladder that could be pulled up and stored inside whenever the household wanted extra security, whether from raiding parties or simply from the worst of the winter wind sweeping along ground level. A pulled-up ladder turned an entire room into something close to a sealed vault against the weather outside. Inside, the room feels compact, and by now you've probably guessed why. Small rooms mean less air for a modest fire to warm, and less exposed wall surface for heat to escape through. Notice, too, how these rooms cluster together, wall against wall, room against room, rather than standing apart from each other the way separate houses might elsewhere. An interior wall shared between two rooms doesn't lose heat to the outside world at all. Only the outer walls, the ones actually facing open air, have to contend with the cold directly. Cluster enough rooms together in one continuous block, and you dramatically reduce how much of the whole structure is ever exposed to winter weather in the first place. It's the same basic principle you saw at work in the longhouse, families and rooms packed together for warmth, just expressed here in stone and sun-dried earth instead of bark and timber poles. A small fire burns in a hearth, sometimes set against a wall, sometimes near the center of the floor, depending on the specific community and the period, the smoke finding its way out through a hole in the roof or a small opening near the top of the wall. The roof above you tells its own story of careful construction. Heavy peeled logs, called vigas, span the width of the room, laid across from wall to wall. Over those main beams comes a layer of smaller wood, split branches or reeds laid tightly together, and over that, a final layer of packed earth, much like the roofing you saw on the earth lodges far to the north, though built for a landscape that receives far less snow and needs to manage rain and occasional storms instead. That earthen roof needed regular attention, resurfaced and repaired after hard rain or heavy snowmelt, but it did the job it needed to do, keeping heat inside and weather outside for as long as the household kept up with its maintenance. Small windows, where they existed at all in the older architecture, stayed deliberately narrow. Every opening in a wall is a place where warmth can escape and cold can enter. And builders here understood that trade-off just as clearly as builders anywhere else on this continent. Better to keep the room a little darker and a little warmer than to open it up to light at the cost of the cold pouring in alongside it. Step back outside, onto one of the terraced roof levels, and look out over the wider village. Plazas sit at the heart of many Pueblo communities, open gathering spaces where daily life, ceremony, and community continued even through the winter months, often positioned to catch whatever sun the season offered. Storage rooms, sometimes windowless entirely, held corn, beans, and squash much like the storage spaces you saw in the earth lodges and the longhouse, because Pueblo communities were farmers too, growing crops in a landscape that demanded careful water management and generations of accumulated knowledge about exactly when and where to plant. Winter survival here, as everywhere else tonight, depended on food stored months in advance, just as much as it depended on the walls themselves. And once again, you find community doing quiet, essential work alongside architecture. A multi-story pueblo, home to many families living in adjoining rooms, meant shared walls, shared warmth, shared labor, and shared knowledge passed down through generations about which rooms held heat best, which walls needed resurfacing before the rains came, and which direction the winter sun would fall across the plaza on the shortest day of the year. 4 homes, 4 landscapes, 4 different sets of problems, and 4 remarkably intelligent answers. An earth lodge, heavy and patient, built to outlast the deep, unbroken cold of the northern plains by burying its people gently beneath a blanket of soil that barely noticed the difference between afternoon and midnight. A teepee, light and mobile, built to move with the herds across open country, using little more than hide and a clever gap of trapped, circulating air to hold back a wind with nothing to slow it down for miles. A longhouse, long and communal, built to gather many families under one continuous roof in the forests of the Northeast, where dozens of small fires and dozens of bodies added together achieved what no single household could have managed alone. And a pueblo, dense and sun-warmed, built from thick adobe and stone to soak in the desert's daytime heat and release it slowly through the punishing cold of a southwestern night. None of these homes copied one another. None of them needed to. Each one belonged completely to the land that shaped it. And now you understand the deeper truth sitting underneath the myth you heard at the very start of this journey. These houses never magically ignored winter. People inside them still felt the cold. Fires still burned low in the coldest hours before dawn. Storms still tested every wall and every family every single year. The real achievement was never a house that made winter disappear. It was a whole system, shelter and clothing and stored food and shared labor and generations of quiet, careful observation, all working together so well that ordinary people could keep living through seasons that might otherwise have ended them. The wind reaches you gently now, wherever you happen to be resting as this story comes to a close. Whatever the details of the particular winter home each of these peoples built, they were all answering the exact same question you first heard back at the beginning of tonight's journey. Not how to defeat the cold, how to live alongside it, carefully, patiently, generation after generation, until surviving it stopped feeling impossible. Let your eyes stay closed now, if they aren't already. Let the last of tonight's fire settle into quiet embers in your mind. There's nothing left to do, nothing left to figure out, nothing waiting for you except sleep. And as always, we'll see you in the past.